Ms. Sanchez, we can start whenever you're ready.
Okay. Do we have who's on our committee?
It's you, Mr. Knox, Mr. Santos, Ms. Greenwood, and Mr. Green, and we do have a quorum.
Excellent. All right. So let's go ahead and get started. It is 8 a.m. And I'll call this meeting of the Corporate Governance Committee to order. Should we begin with the announcements or the approval of the minutes?
The announcements,
The announcements. Okay.
Thank you, Ms. Sanchez. This meeting is being conducted as a virtual meeting, so I will do a roll call of the trustees to confirm attendance. Ms. Sanchez?
Here.
Mr. Knox?
Good morning, I'm here.
Good morning. Mr. Santos?
Present.
Thank you. Ms. Greenwood?
Good morning, I'm here as well.
Thank you. Mr. Green? Mr. Jones? Mrs. Jones? Mr. Kehoe? Mr. Kelly? Staff participating in the meeting include CIO John Grable, Chief Counsel Stephen Rice, investment staff Scott Drazel and Dale Johnson, and we have consultant Makita and Alborn on this call. Trustees, please use the Zoom chat option to be placed in this queue. At this time, we ask all meeting participants to mute their mics until you're ready to speak, and now we may proceed with the agenda.
Fantastic. So we'll move on to item 2, approval of the minutes. Do I have a motion or any changes?
I will second.
Got a motion by Mr. Santos and a second by Mr. Knox. Can we take the roll?
Yes. Ms. Sanchez?
Yeah, aye.
Thank you. Mr. Knox?
Aye.
Mr. Santos?
Aye.
Thank you. And Ms. Greenwood?
Aye.
Okay, the motion passes unanimously.
Great. Do we have any public comment?
We do not.
All right. We will move on to the non-consent item. The first non-consent item, which is a recommendation by Scott Drazel, Principal Investment Officer, that the board advance a revised corporate governance committee charter to the Board of Investments for approval. Any comments there, Scott?
Sure. Good morning, Madam Chair, members of the committee, and trustees. I'm happy to give a quick overview if that's helpful of the item. As mentioned by Chair Sanchez, and note for this item we don't need the presentation quite yet. Thank you. Item 4A is a recommendation for the committee to forward to the board several modifications to the Corporate Governance Committee charter. The proposed revisions are intended to reflect recent policy name changes and organizational updates with LACERA. A redline version of the revisions is included as an attachment to the committee materials, and a quick summary of the revisions is explained in the cover memo. As described in that memo, the committee was established about 15 years ago with a stated purpose to oversee proxy voting and corporate governance work. LACERA's governance work has expanded in recent years to include corporate engagements and other matters that are kind of more commonly known as investment stewardship now. So the first modification would refine the committee purpose to encompass not only proxy voting and corporate governance, but also reference investment stewardship initiatives like the corporate engagement work. We think this is in line with the committee's oversight work in recent years and would bring the charter in line with practice. The second modification updates references to LACERA's corporate governance and stewardship principles policy. That would reflect the policy name change from the corporate governance principles when in 2020, the committee and board merged that policy with a procedural policy to become the corporate governance and stewardship principles. So that's just a name update. And the third key refinement is modifying the cadence of meetings to meet at least twice per year. That would reflect formal board action in 2018 on the expected rhythm of all of the Board of Investment Standing Committee meetings, and also reflects the committee's recent cadence of meetings. So we note that LACERA has several governing documents and policies. They lay out roles and responsibilities, including those referenced at the top of the committee charter. They include the Board of Investments charter, the bylaws, the investment policy statement, which defines some roles and responsibilities, corporate governance and stewardship principles, which also define roles and responsibilities. So we have worked with the legal office and endeavored to avoid duplication of language in the committee charter to try to avoid any confusion in the red line version that's before you for consideration. So with that, happy to take any questions or comments.
Thank you. It was pretty straightforward, although do we have any other questions?
Move approval.
Thank you,
Second,
Mr. Sanchez, and thank you, Ms. Greenwood. Can we take the roll?
Yes. Ms. Sanchez?
Yeah, aye.
Thank you. Mr. Knox?
Aye.
Mr. Santos?
Aye.
Ms. Greenwood?
aye.
Okay, the motion passes unanimously.
Okay, super. So we'll move on to reports. We will start with the proxy voting results and trends report by, and this will be given by either Mr. Drazel or Mr. Johnson. Who's going to be giving that presentation?
Great, thank you, Madam Chair. I'll kick it
Great.
off and then hand it
Great.
over. Thanks. Thanks to Noah Damsky for steering our slides today. Item 5A is the annual review of LACERA's proxy voting results and trend lines for the fiscal year that ended on June 30th for the committee's review. I think we were on slide 2. Yep. To level set the discussion for any newer trustees joining us today, LACERA votes proxies for its global equities portfolio consistent with the fund's own principles for good governance, which are all outlined in LACERA's custom corporate governance and stewardship principles policy. We vote all global equity investment accounts where we've retained voting authority, which, as you can see in the chart across the bottom of this slide, expanded from about 19% of the equities portfolio value 5 years ago to over 90% this past year. So moving on to slide 3, this is also a quick recap of the voting process. It starts, of course, in that upper right corner with defining policies and principles for good governance that this committee develops and forwards to the board. The board then reviews and approves. In that bottom left corner, staff then works to execute votes in line with those principles by working with available research from different sources, proxy research firms, and an online voting platform. We then summarize the voting results for the committee's review after the fiscal year ends, when we have results and trend lines for available for analysis. So moving on to slide 4, this is the bird's eye view of the fiscal year 2022 proxy voting. As you can see, we voted over 7,500 meetings in 65 global markets. And as noted in the bar graph across the bottom, most annual meetings that we vote take place in a very compressed fourth quarter of the fiscal year. That's between April and the end of June, when most companies are holding their annual meetings after their own fiscal year results are published. So for slide 5, I'm going to turn it over to Dale to walk through the trend lines and some of the statistical results.
Thank you, Scott. Good morning, Chair, members of the committee, and trustees. Focusing on the right side of slide 5, we show the 5 core guiding principles that frame LACERA's corporate governance and stewardship principles, which guide our votes on corporate proxies. On the left side of the slide, we categorize ballot items appearing on corporate proxies into the same 5 core topics, which encircle the donut chart. As you can see, voting on director elections account for the majority, approximately 55% of all voting items. And while social and environmental proposals often get a fair amount of attention, since the topics are usually newer or less developed, we note for trustees that such proposals account for less than 1% of all voting items, as shown on the top of the chart. Moving on to slide 6, we break down the number of proposals by whether the proposal was put forward by the company management or a shareholder. Generally, shareholder proposals account for a small fraction of total proposals we see on ballots, about 2%, as noted in the chart on the left. That figure has remained constant as a proportion of LACERA's voting items in recent years. LACERA's overall support for management and shareholder proposals has also remained consistent over the past 3 years, as guided by LACERA's corporate governance and stewardship principles. We'll break down some of the moving parts behind these numbers in the next 2 slides. On slide 7, we further expand on management-sponsored proposals and focus on 3 key areas: director elections, advisory vote on executive compensation, also known as say on pay, and auditor ratification. As noted on the top chart, LACERA supported 60% of directors up for election and highlights the key reasons for votes against. Lack of independent boards and directors account for a significant majority of the votes against directors. Another contributor to the votes against directors was focused on key leadership at boards with lack of credible track record of inclusion of directors with diverse attributes. Also, as communicated to the committee at its April meeting, we ratcheted up votes against certain directors if they oversee companies that maintain differential voting rights and have not introduced any provisions by which that weighted voting rights system will sunset. The middle chart displays LACERA's support level for say-on-pay ballot items. Say-on-pay votes are non-binding voting items required by the 2010 Dodd-Frank law, by which investors can weigh in on whether we think overall CEO pay practices are acceptable. LACERA's principles state that executive compensation and incentives should align the interests of executives and investors. So there should be a balance between incentivizing and rewarding executives for superior performance, while encouraging risk mitigation and avoiding excessive risks that may be detrimental to the firm's long-term financial value. Over the past 3 years, we've seen unjustified adjustments to metrics and targets for incentive plans and egregious one-time awards to reward executives for navigating the COVID pandemic. LACERA votes against say-on-pay proposals where that pay for performance leak is broken as a message for the board to revisit and revise their pay practices. The bottom of the slide provides brief examples of votes that LACERA cast this year on management-sponsored proposals. I'd like to highlight the General Electric meeting where LACERA opposed the say-on-pay vote for the 5th consecutive year after the company continues to tweak metrics and targets to its incentive plans, resulting in an substantiated payments to its executives, or what's often referred to as, quote, moving the goalposts and enabling more pay regardless of performance. Moving on to slide 8, we delve into shareholder-sponsored proposals. The top chart highlights that governance-oriented proposals are the largest component, representing approximately 90% of shareholder proposals. LACERA's support for governance-related proposals fell slightly from 2021 with little change in the number of items voted. Common governance topics are noted next to the bar chart and have remained fairly consistent over the years. LACERA's support for environmental and social proposals increased, represented mostly by shareholder proposals in the US, which often request reports on how companies address business risks that may impact financial value. Outside the US, shareholder proposals are often more prescriptive and request the board take specific actions that may not be in the best interest of all investors. The bottom of the slide provides several examples of shareholder proposals that LACERA supported during the proxy season. Here I'll highlight the sample vote on the bottom right corner of the slide. LACERA supported 23 proposals, 8 of which received majority support, asking companies to report on their DEI efforts in the overall context of their human capital management and corporate strategy. Moving on to slide 9, we provide more insight on the differences in LACERA's support level of management and shareholder proposals in the US relative to outside the US. To be clear, LACERA's principles are universally applied globally, but as reported on the previous slides, there is a meaningful difference in support levels by region because of local market practices. The top left chart compares support levels for management proposals for the 2 regions and highlights differences driving the support levels. The bottom right chart highlights vote levels for shareholder proposals and key differences. Slide 10 addresses some of the bigger themes of management-sponsored proposals for the broader proxy season. In earlier slides, I commented on how these items were addressed in LACERA's proxy voting, but this slide summarizes some key market developments, including outcomes and trends. Generally, say-on-pay ballot items and directors continue to receive high levels of support from investors. Despite investors showing a high level of support for pay practices than LACERA, with 91 being the average investor support for CEO pay, we note here that there are some high-profile negative votes. For example, which was also highlighted on slide 7, JP Morgan received only 31% support after the board's compensation committee granted the CEO a special bonus of shares valued at over $50 million plus that fully vest after 5 years with no rigorous links to how the company performs. Investors' focus on board quality continues to drive disclosure and evaluation of board practices and composition to reflect a diverse set of perspectives and skills represented on the board to drive company strategy. We note several trends of increasing board diversity among large company indices, including that 97% of large companies now disclose their board's diversity attributes, and no S&P 500 companies lack any directors of color as of last year. However, we recognize companies have more progress to make to cast a wide net for talent, inclusive of diverse directors. The next slide summarizes themes identified among shareholder proposals, particularly with an environmental and social focus. We note that there continues to be ever higher levels of investor support for companies to disclose and reduce greenhouse gas emissions, including over 2/3 majority support at several consumer discretionary companies. While the volume of climate-related proposals has doubled year over year, we also note that the support level on some proposals decreased as some of them want companies to take prescriptive and binding actions, such as asking banks to stop any financing activity for fossil fuel businesses that may impede financing for an energy transition. Similarly, there continues to be strong investor support for more transparency on workforce composition, such as disclosing EEO-1 reports, and also for civil rights racial equity audits, which request a report on evaluating the extent to which company practices may have disparate impact on communities, customers, or other stakeholders that may pose business impediments and liabilities. Moving on to slide 12, we provide some quick insights on regulatory developments shaping the proxy voting operations. Key among these, as we've discussed in the past, is that the SEC has issued a final rule that will introduce a universal proxy card for contested director elections starting in January 2023. What the universal proxy card does is when an activist investor proposes alternative candidates for the board, all candidates, including incumbents and dissidents, will be listed on the same proxy card. This enables investors like LACERA to pick and choose among the candidates that we think are best suited to serve investors, as opposed to the past, where we could only often choose to vote on only one of the two, either the management or the dissident slate. We, along with CII, have long advocated for this rule and believe it will extend investor franchise to more meaningfully select among the most qualified board candidates. The other updates here pertain to some revisions to regulatory guidance for proxy research, which includes dropping some requirements for proxy research firms to provide companies subject to the research with copies of the reports before or concurrent to distributing to paying clients like LACERA. Investors had voiced concerns that such provisions could undermine the timeliness of research availability, as well as introduce avenues for inappropriate interference in the independence of the research. Moving on to slide 13, we're providing an operational update here. Consistent with policy, we strive to vote all shares to the extent feasible and practical. We summarize here for the committee's key reasons where we did not vote. That includes in some markets where shares are required to be blocked from trading for a period of time in order to hold shares through the meeting date. It's known as share blocking. LACERA also participates in share lending, where shares on loan are not eligible for voting. Last year, that impacted about 10% of shares. We can and do recall shares in advance if we know the items appearing on proxies. As noted here, about 88% of companies do not publish proxy items in advance of the record date on which shares are determined eligible to vote. We continue to work with associations like International Corporate Governance Network and the Council of Institutional Investors to improve market practices to enhance investors' ability to vote. With that, we welcome any questions.
Super, thank you. This is probably one of my favorite presentations that we do here at LACERA. I just want to thank you for the work that you put into it. We have a meeting for a question from Mr. Knox.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair. On a couple of questions, two different slides. The one that you just mentioned on page 13, you mentioned that we can recall shares on loan in advance of a vote if we want to exercise our vote, correct?
Correct.
And is there an economic cost to doing that? Is that something we consider before we recall those shares?
Yes, we would evaluate that consideration.
And just in terms of the cost benefit of exercising our vote versus the financial penalty or loss or whatever of recalling it?
Correct. It would be potential loss of income from not having those shares on loan versus our economic interest in the company and the value of that vote.
And then back on page 11 or slide 11, please. Environmental risk mitigation at the bottom. So on this one, the last bullet was interesting. Average support for environmental proposals was down compared to 2021, as some proposals were more prescriptive on business strategies. So talk to me a little bit about that one, please. And is this just, you know, I think there's a lot of good intentions out there, but are there going to be ebbs and flows on support as I don't know.
Yes, so the environmental category encompassed those climate proposals where I discussed there were some proposals at banks requesting that they cease financing of activities related to fossil fuels.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think that's where there was less support for those proposals, and that impacted the overall environmental support level. But it's just the nuance of how these proposals are presented. And sometimes they can be prescriptive, and we're concerned about telling the company how to do their business.
Yeah.
So we probably wouldn't be supporting those proposals. And outside the US in the environmental category, they are definitely much more prescriptive. For example, in Japan, the nuclear companies receive a multitude of proposals asking that they shut down their nuclear operations.
Yeah, and that's interesting. I guess it's easy to gloss over that and think, oh, wow, environmental support is down, but it's all in how it's phrased and whatever the particular initiative is.
Yep.
And then one quick last one, I'll turn it back, Madam Chair. Thank you. Was on the GE vote that you mentioned, how did that one turn out? And what was the support like for the one where you said we voted against the incentives or the pay?
So on the JP Morgan Say on Pay vote, it only received 31% support. For the GE one, it still received majority support, but it was in the 50s, as I recall. So it was still very low support,
Okay.
although it did pass.
Thank you, Mr. Johnson. Good presentation.
Thank you.
Thank you. Any other questions?
I have a question, although I believe it might be covered in the next presentation with regard to sort of how the SEC is thinking about making it easier to submit proposals by shareholders, shareholder-sponsored proposals. Do you want to wait until the next presentation, or do you want to address that now?
Thanks, Ms. Sanchez. We can address it now on slide 12. LACERA's principles consider investors should have the right under reasonable circumstances, provisions to put forward a proposal. And the SEC does tweak what those provisions are from time to time. What's mostly under consideration right now at the SEC is what level of support a proposal should receive in order to be eligible to be resubmitted. And what we've seen in recent years is, proposals that have single-digit support. Typically, the proponent is going to revisit the language in the request to try to configure language that would garner higher levels of support. The SEC is looking at tweaking those provisions, but I don't foresee that we anticipate a significant impact on the volume of proposals. The more considerable impact in this last year was that the SEC was more permissive on which proposals went forward that may address some corporate issues would consider constitute ordinary business, for example, or were substantially already implemented. So this speaks to Mr. Knox's earlier question on the level of support on some proposals. If the SEC is reviewing which abide by their guidelines and are more permissive, some investors might consider that the proposal has been adequately addressed. So there are a few different cross currents in that debate. But we are working with CII and others on weighing it. Thank you.
Super. Thank you. Mr. Sanchez has a question.
It's actually, good morning. It's not a question, it's a comment. And in particular, this goes to my colleagues on the board and in the committee, and particularly on the board. is that, as you can see, this is very important work that we do. And CII plays a key role for us. That's the organization that Mr. Dreisel is the chair for the public sector. We have played a key role in there. He, unfortunately, and there's going to be further discussions on this for that later on in the agenda. But I just want to encourage my colleagues to attend and get involved in CII. Mr. Dreisel is going to be termed down next year, and it's going to be a major loss unless we are able to get somebody else back on the board. So something that I will encourage my colleagues to get involved and hopefully someday get on the board. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Santos. Okay, any last comments or questions? Hearing none, we will move on to item B, which is the update and review of corporate governance engagement and stewardship initiatives, which will also be presented by Mr. Dreisel and Mr. Johnson. Take it away.
Great. Thank you again, Madam Chair. So as mentioned, 5B reviews updates and next steps of LACERA's key corporate governance engagement initiatives and other stewardship work. Now, we want to say at the outset that we recognize that trustees are familiar with aspects of this report, since items have come up from time to time during the course of board and committee meetings in the last year. So this report is really intended just to provide the committee with a higher level comprehensive view of the fund's governance work in order to report on key developments and anticipated next steps for the committee's review. So we'll talk through the deck included as attachment 1. We've also included in trustees' materials LACERA's 2022 corporate governance and stewardship update. That's attachment 2, as mentioned, which is now available on lacera.com for members and the public for ready access. So let's start with slide 2. Thank you, Noah. LACERA pursues several stewardship strategies to put the LACERA's principles for good governance that are outlined in our corporate governance and stewardship principles into practice. That is with an aim of protecting and enhancing financial performance in line with and compelled by fiduciary duties. Those strategies include the proxy voting, which we just covered in the previous report, but also engagement with portfolio companies and policymakers, integration of financially relevant ESG factors that might influence financial returns, and how we are transparent about our work to steward our assets in line with fund principles. So on slide 4, we will start by going over some updates to the engagement initiatives to help focus when and where we engage portfolio companies, given that we have several thousand holdings. Just as a reminder, the committee did lay out a guiding framework about 5 years ago to help focus on key priorities. That includes advocating financial market policies and regulations in line with our principles, often in conjunction with associations that we're involved with, such as CII and ILPA, promoting governance best practices at portfolio companies to help protect and enhance value. That includes our engagement work to encourage portfolio companies to cast a wide net for director talent, inclusive of diverse backgrounds, expanding investment useful and comparable information on how companies manage ESG-related business risks and opportunities so that investors can analyze that information in portfolio decisions, including our support for the Sustainability Accounting Standards Board that we hosted a guest speaker on at the spring meeting. And of course, when we're pragmatic, we try to exercise some leadership, such as elevating research on investor rights related to SPACs and LACERA's DEI work. So I'm going to turn it over to Dale to go over updates and next steps on these initiatives, starting with the corporate board diversity work on slide 5.
Thank you, Scott. As articulated in LACERA's corporate governance and stewardship principles, we rely on corporate boards to best serve investor interests. So we want companies to cast a wide net for the best talent for boards, inclusive of diverse backgrounds that can help look out for and oversee risk to corporate strategy and execution. Corporate boards should be comprised of highly qualified directors with a diverse set of skills, backgrounds, and experiences relevant to the company's business strategy. A diverse and inclusive board, including but not limited to diverse gender, racial and ethnic backgrounds, gender identities, sexual orientations, and disability status is better situated to constructively deliberate and prudently guide business strategy in investors' interests. LACERA encourages board diversity through multiple strategies, including proxy voting and corporate engagement. This slide updates trustees on our work over the past 4 years with California funds such as CalPERS, CalSTRS, and San Francisco employees to engage companies with an apparent lack of board diversity based upon available public disclosures and reaching out to those companies in letters and dialogues to encourage a sharpened focus on board quality by casting a wide net for board candidates inclusive of diverse gender, racial, and LGBTQ backgrounds. Over this time period, 310 directors, including women and/or people of color, have been appointed to boards of 184 of the 231 companies engaged. This includes 56 diverse directors appointed to 43 boards among the 57 engaged companies this past fiscal year. As presented on the top of the slide, our engagements start with letters and dialogues with corporate leaders and independent board directors to understand their process for board evaluations, skills assessments, and director recruitment. We encourage diversity to be memorialized in director nomination policies and for boards to report on how they consider diversity when conducting director recruitments. All 4 funds continue to collaborate, including engaging 60 more mid and small cap companies this year. Slide 6 provides a breakdown of what companies we've engaged in recent years have disclosed about the diversity attributes of their director appointments. Following our presentation last year, trustees requested a view into the breakdown of director appointments. We note that we do not prescribe specific appointments and rely on disclosures based on voluntary, self-identified attributes, which is what is represented here. On slide 7, we capture some experts from governance policies and documents that engaged companies have revised to affirm commitment to diversity and/or to include diverse directors, candidates, and interview slates. Moving on to slide 8. Slide 8 recaps some updates to our work to encourage the availability of high-quality investment useful ESG corporate disclosures. LACERA's principles expect firms to provide oversight and disclosure of relevant factors and how they are managed and mitigated so that investors can assess the potential financial impact on company value. To encourage disclosure, LACERA affiliated with the Sustainability Accounting Standards Board in 2019 and endorsed the Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosures also in 2019. Each of these initiatives developed frameworks for disclosure to provide comparable investment useful reporting on material ESG and climate risks. As enumerated in the chart on the bottom right of the slide, the adoption of the frameworks has been significant and rapid, with now over half of large global companies reporting ESG and climate-related risks in accordance with the SASB and TCFD frameworks. To this end, as previously reported to the board, the International Financial Reporting Standards has created a new International Sustainability Standards Board that, as of August, has incorporated the SASB standards and TCFD frameworks. Currently, the ISSB is further codifying the SASB standards into IFRS practices, and LACERA is part of an investor alliance to continue to encourage market adoption of the reporting frameworks to help guide corporate disclosures. Moving on to the next slide. LACERA's corporate governance and stewardship principles recognize that climate change presents potential financial, operational, and regulatory risks to companies in which LACERA invests and to the broader market. LACERA addresses climate-related risks through several channels, including proxy voting, portfolio assessment, and company engagement. Through the Climate Action 100+, LACERA is collaborating with other investors to encourage over 160 of the most carbon-intensive companies to mitigate climate risks. These companies represent approximately 80% of global industrial emissions and about half of LACERA's public markets carbon footprint. Engagements are focused on ensuring commitments and disclosure of short, medium, and long-term emissions reduction targets are robust and aligned with the Paris Agreement to limit global warming to below 2 degrees by 2050. As noted here, a notable portion of engaged companies have adopted longer-term targets for emissions, such as achieving net zero. The initiative is therefore particularly focused on encouraging companies to describe how they're going to get there. And that is, what are the interim pathways for emissions reductions? What is their capital allocation strategy that supports the pathway to transition? How do executive pay and incentives align with those commitments? How does their lobbying activities align with climate commitments? And how are they taking into account transitions of local communities and workers to achieve a just energy transition? We'll now pass it on to Scott.
Great, thanks, Dale. So slide 10 it summarizes the policy advocacy that we've conducted in the past year to advocate investor rights and corporate reporting of material risks. Each of these items has previously been reported to the board and includes work on private fund fee transparency, supporting the SEC's proposed rule which would level the playing field for fee transparency across the US market, encouraging legislative proposals to restrict differential voting rights at public companies, and facilitating consistent and more reliable corporate reporting of financial risks and opportunities related to climate change and workforce management. Each of these is linked here and available on LACERA.com. We'll move on to the ESG integration overview. Starting with slide 12, thank you. LACERA's investment policy statement lays out LACERA's policy stance on ESG as part of the fund's investment strategy, which recognizes that ESG factors may present investment risks or opportunities and can shape the risk-return profile of our investments and ultimately financial returns. Therefore, we endeavor to integrate into portfolio management, namely through our due diligence of external managers on their research and portfolio management processes, and increasingly folding in data analytics to identify areas of concentrated risk or possible opportunity. Slide 13 is a quick recap of LACERA's ESG assessment scale. We do this for each external mandate that is either under consideration or already in the portfolio. All asset classes across the fund are using standard DDQs to help guide an evaluation of to what extent each mandate is identifying material ESG factors and how they assess financial risks and opportunities related to ESG and incorporate that into their portfolio construction, management, and other investment decisions. We've got an ongoing ranking of each manager on a 5-point scale. It's laid out across the bottom. That ranges from minimal or no consideration of ESG to higher scores reflecting increasingly systematic and sophisticated approaches, well-resourced approaches to consider ESG risks and opportunities. This is intended to reflect ESG as a continuum and not necessarily the binary yes-no equation that sometimes kind of gets tossed around in market discussions. ESG assessments are presented in every manager recommendation presented to the board, and individual manager assessments are also included in the board's quarterly performance reports that trustees are receiving now. Throughout, we emphasize understanding ESG as part of investment, a part of external managers' investment process, not as a separate ESG product, and really look at it as an additional lens into manager quality to see how they're identifying and managing operational risks that could impact financial performance. Slide 14, we thought we'd offer a quick snapshot. Moving on to 14, thank you. This is a quick snapshot of the current breakdown of our ESG assessments by asset class. You'll note that managers continue to have a range of approaches. We're seeing some corners of the portfolio increasingly more systematic and comprehensive in how they're managing ESG risks. That includes increased focus in the last several years in private equity, for example. But ESG is more developed in growth and buyout strategies there than venture capital funds from what we're seeing. So that's an additional insight to kind of compare like for like when there are similar options and put it in context of past performance and organizational quality in the holistic view that we're taking. The assessment scale is intended to reflect a thoughtful and more nuanced approach to ESG as both research and portfolio management process, not a check the mark exercise. And we aim to continue to refine as we move forward. Slide 15, to complement the qualitative review and the assessments that we're doing, we also are increasingly accessing ESG related data analytics. This follows the board's 2020 approval of new risk platform data vendors. These data sources have enabled us to look at carbon footprinting, for example, and use that to build out some scenario analyses in public market asset classes where data is more available to look at forward-looking risks and opportunities related to climate exposures. That said, even though public market data is more prevalent, we're currently working to expand our access to data for private market asset classes. That includes LACERA's recent affiliation to the Global Real Estate Sustainability Benchmark, or GRESB, which the board approved last summer. That provides some data analytics that we can fold into our work. We're also seeing more private equity general partners starting to directly report on ESG and climate data that we can fold in. And the team is currently working on and anticipating modeling some of the energy transition climate-related data for private market exposures in order to kind of fill out more of a total fund view. So we'll look forward to reporting back to trustees on some of that data as it becomes more available for insight and analysis.
Madam Chair, can I ask a quick question?
Absolutely, you may.
Sorry, Mr. Drazel, just quick question, is the data getting better? I know you say the data is more prevalent and I see the various, sources that you're citing there. I know we use Sustainalytics here at TTC. Just curious if it is getting better, if it is getting more consistent across the different sources.
Sure. Thank you for the question, Mr. Knox. So it varies. 5 or 6 years ago, if you looked at carbon footprinting of scope 1 and 2 by different data vendors, you could have been looking at very different numbers. What we're seeing now, interestingly, is more convergence on the numbers. That might reflect more harmonization of kind of global reporting frameworks and like the greenhouse gas reporting protocol, for example. But we do hope that this work is benefited by our support and encouragement of more companies reporting consistent with the SASB standards, which really try to focus on which factors are most material across 77 different industries. So we're hoping that there's a synergistic approach here that improves data over time, but also recognizes that we don't want perfect to be the enemy of the good, so we can use some of the data as it's coming forward and try to understand the weaknesses and strengths in a responsible manner.
Thank you.
Great. Mr. Santos, you have a question?
Yes, thank you. Mr. Drazel, as you know, there's been, I believe, 17 different attorney generals throughout the nation attacking the ESG, that anybody who takes, and I'm paraphrasing obviously, that anybody who take anybody like myself, like us, who take ESG into consideration is in violation of their fiduciary duty. I don't believe all that, and that's why I really appreciate the strategy that we follow in LACERA, that we invest opportunistic. But I was wondering if you have any comments with regards to those attacks, and what's the status with all that?
Thanks for the question, Mr. Santos. What we see in the letter of some of the resolutions coming forward is a reiteration of the same basic principles of fiduciary duty that we abide by and that we're compelled by. That includes loyalty to our members and beneficiaries, as well as duty of care and prudence to take into account information that could impact upon the financial performance. Some of the resolutions, despite headlines that reference ESG, do not actually in the letter reference ESG. They reiterate the focus on fiduciary duty. So our approach, we consider not only guided by fiduciary duty, but compelled to try to identify financially relevant investment risks and opportunities and take that information to account to best fulfill our mission to pay and protect benefits.
And what's CII doing with regards to that particular issue to counteract or any Any word on that?
Well, the Council of Institutional Investors is, long focused on the G of ESG, corporate governance as a critical risk, as well as opportunity that better governance better serves longer-term, stable, sustainable financial returns. So the council remains kind of engaged and supportive of all members, regardless of kind of jurisdiction where they're operating. That includes the advocacy work with the SEC in line with our policies, but also trying to provide support and resources to members on how best to, for example, implement proxy voting policies, how to align them with fiduciary duties to, and how to exercise appropriate oversight that votes being executed are in fact consistent with the trustees and board's intent on what constitutes kind of good governance. So a range of different strategies and approaches to address the ongoing discussion in the market.
Thank you, Scott.
Great. So thank you for the question. Should we move on to slide 16, I
please.
believe? Great, thank you. So as trustees are aware, the board recently approved a revised and restated responsible contractor policy. The team is working to implement that revised policy and upfront due diligence of all new real assets funds, as well as developing the reporting mechanisms going forward, as discussed at recent board meetings. So we can jump to slide 17. LACERA approved becoming a signatory to the Principles for Responsible Investment affiliated with the United Nations, the UNPRI, often referred to as. This was back in 2008, shortly after PRI was founded in 2006. As a signatory, LACERA committed to incorporating ESG into investment analysis and practices, including through exercising our ownership rights, like the proxy voting and fund due diligence that we just discussed. In recent years, LACERA has improved its LACERA assessment to A+ and A's across all categories. This is an annual assessment process that PRI conducts. But after 15 years of growth, PRI recently undertook a 2-year process to revise its assessment process, changing scores from letters to a scale based on numbers and stars. We recently received LACERA's 2021 assessment, and note that LACERA continues to score well on the overall approach to ESG and has a range of scores within individual asset classes. So the team is now evaluating PRI's new assessment methodology to identify possible strategies that would inform future steps, while we continue to be guided by ensuring that LACERA's approach to ESG remains firmly rooted in LACERA's own policies and, of course, fiduciary duties. So more to come on this front going forward. Let's jump to slide 18 and 19. Thank you. Lastly, we want to ensure that the governance and stewardship work that LACERA does is being clearly presented to members, beneficiaries, and stakeholders. So we post updates to LACERA.com, including the advocacy letters to the SEC and others. And we've included in committee materials LACERA's new annual update report, which covers the initiatives we've discussed today and at recent board meetings to provide an accessible and transparent look at how LACERA is trying to put our principles into practice across the total fund. So slide 20 is a quick summary of the next steps from each of the sections we just went over. And with that, we would welcome any comments or questions from trustees or members of the committee.
I have one question. Actually, this refers back to the early part of the presentation where you review the engagement for corporate board diversity. I recall when you began that effort that was focused primarily on companies that are domiciled in California. But based on the numbers, should I assume that you've expanded that purview to a larger swath of companies?
Thank you for the question, Ms. Sanchez. That is indeed the case. We have taken a broader view across really the US market to identify laggards and outliers based on available disclosures.
Super. That is great to hear. And obviously the efforts that you're making matter. It still strikes me as frustrating to see kind of the degree to which Hispanic and Latina board appointments continue to lag, but we just have to do our part, and I appreciate it. Mr. Santos, you have a question?
Yeah, actually, it is just a comment, Mr. Dreisel, with regards to the responsible contract policy. Outstanding job. Got so many positive comments regarding the policy, and some people believe that it's probably one of the leading policies across the nation in the industry. So I want to thank you for all the work you did. So keep up the good work.
Thank you, Mr. Santos. And I'd be remiss if I didn't also incorporate Jim Rice and our legal office, Steve Rice and John Gabriel, and the full team that's kind of behind developing as well as implementing that revised policy.
Super, Mr. Jones.
Yes, good morning, everyone. Just a question, Scott, are we collaborating with CalSTRS and CalPERS on this? And as such, are our approaches thus far and the infrastructure around our approach, are we very similar to, slightly behind of, kind of ahead of? Can you just kind of give me a sense of how you feel relative to the partners who we're working with on these things thematically, kind of where we are?
Sure. Thank you for the question, Mr. Jones. Fundamentally, we're guided by LACERA's policies as this board and committee develop, but as longer-term pension plans, diversified ownership, obviously we have a lot of common interests with other public plans. So we do collaborate with some of our peers. That's exemplified in some of our initiatives like the board diversity project, where we just have a very effective ongoing dialogue with the San Francisco Employee Retirement System, CalPERS and CalSTRS, but then also through broader organizational efforts like CII, in which we're actively involved. We also share some insights just on the fly, frankly, as staff. Historically, these teams kind of benefit from sharing knowledge as well as effective practices in real time. So I do see that Mr. Grable has his hand up, and perhaps I'll defer to the chair to
Mr. Grable, just one quick follow-up.
Yeah, Mr. Grable, you may speak.
Real quick, if I may, Madam Chair, just a real quick follow-up that Mr. Grable can also respond to. So then, do you find that this particular approach, since we seem to be on the more advanced size relative to pension funds, are we, through CII or others, are we kind of in any way kind of maybe exporting some of our expertise or experience to other pension funds, because maybe we had a period of time when the board was a little bit more forward thinking perhaps on these matters than others were at the time? I'm just trying to get a sense of just where we are. Thanks, Madam Chair. And then I'm sorry to interrupt you, Mr. Grable.
Good morning, trustees. Thank you, Madam Chair, committee members. I'll answer the questions in a couple ways. First, I think that Scott is being immodest. The work that Scott and Dale do is fantastic. Period, full stop, exclamation point, come up with some other punctuation. I think that not only is this work fantastic on a standalone basis, but there is direct connection to our strategic initiatives, to our investments. So everything we do is connected. So I think that Scott is being, incredibly immodest. As it relates directly to the question, and this once again goes to some of the pillars that we have in Tide and elsewhere, that given that we're not as big as PERS and STIRS and some other plans, that we are dependent upon, amplifying our voice. And, and this goes back to a comment that Chair Santos was making through organizations such as CII, that we do a really good job of working with various organizations to once again speak louder than what the two dedicated people we have at LACERA. One last thing is, and maybe this is an area of improvement that we've discussed, is Scott showed what we show on our website. We could probably do a better job of telling our own story. I think that I don't have the data as to the number of people that go to LACERA.com to look at our various reports. They are fantastic, but we could probably do a better job of sharing them.
Thank you, Mr. Grable. Always looking for things to improve on. Mr. Santos, go ahead.
Yes, thank you. As a follow-up to Mr. Jones' question, the board over the years have discussed this particular issue. How far up front should we be in any of these issues? And we have always allowed the CalPERS and CalSTRS to take the lead. They're always in the front page of the newspapers. So while we and the staff do tremendous work in this area, we'd like to kind of play a lower key role, and that's why our participation in different organizations such as CII and others is really critical, because we can do a lot of work there, but yet not be in the front page of the LA Times. So that has been some of the thinking in the past. So I thought I will say that for background.
Okay, super. Are there any last questions? I'm just cognizant of time because I know we're starting to run short here. Okay, thank you for that presentation. It was, as always, very, very interesting, full of insightful information, and very proud of the work that you do here. It's incredible. Item C is for information only, but regards the update regarding the Council of Institutional Investors board nomination. I don't know if Mr. Santos, I expected a comment.
Thank you. And so this particular memo addresses exactly what I was talking about earlier, and my plea for my colleagues to get more involved in CII. So my question to you, Scott, is, if I remember correctly, you in the memo you stated that you terminate out next year, but yet you're not recommending a candidate at this point. From my perspective, I think it's really important that we continue the work that you and many of us have done, and hopefully we can continue the leadership. And I don't know if Mr. Johnson be available and eligible to run again, because I know he didn't finish his full term. I just want to make sure that we continue to be in leadership in CII. And my plea to my colleagues on the board is get involved, because it will be wonderful that someday we will have a board member be on the board. But definitely the staff has done tremendous work, and that's something that we need to think about, how we're going to replace Mr. Dreisel and hopefully Mr. Johnson.
Mr. Dreisel, you have a response?
Sure. Thank you, Ms. Sanchez, Mr. Santos, for the input and the guidance and support. We absolutely consider CII to be a valuable resource and tool. As John mentioned, we often say we want to amplify our voice. 75 billion or 72 billion is a lot of assets, but obviously we're stronger working with other funds towards common objectives. So we absolutely will remain tightly involved with CII. We've got a direct line to staff. We've got a direct line to our peers. The CII organizes proxy voting, kind of staff roundtables, organizes a number of other events. As a governance matter, CII does limit a service for individuals to 5 consecutive terms. That does not impede somebody from being presented for eligible for a candidate after a year. LACERA also has the option of switching voices and presenting another candidate. We are several months ahead of the time frame, but the memo is really intended just to provide an update to the board of where we're at and what we see kind of coming down the pipe. That includes that other funds will take into consideration, how long has a fund been on the board, and it might be an opportunity to allow other members to step forward as well for the short term. But this by no means is indicating a step away from CII. Will remain, I think we're involved more than ever, if anything, and we'll continue to do so. So thank you for the comments.
Okay, Mr. Santos.
Thank you.
Okay, that wasn't a hand, that was a thumbs up. All right, super. So thank you for that. Moving on, do we have any items for staff review? Don't think we do.
We don't.
Okay, any items for future agendas?
We don't.
Okay, good. Comments for good of the order? Mr. Jones.
I have a real quick one. Yeah, just given my relative newness to the Southern California area and LA specifically here over the last 6 years. I obviously over the weekend, over the last few days, the issue with the LA City Council and all the kind of layers that's being unpacked. I just want to say that being someone who relishes civic society at the highest level, that I really appreciate the collegiality and the spirit of working together here on behalf of our beneficiaries and our members, and the respect that everyone shows here, regardless of some of the contentious issues that may exist. So I just wanted to state that in the context of the public service that we provide here.
Thank you, Mr. Jones. Well, on that note, I will take a motion to adjourn.
So moved.
Thank you,
Moved.
Mr. Knox. All right, we are 2 minutes late, but we are done.
Linda, should we start the meeting at 10:10?
9:10, yes, we can come back in an hour.
At 10 minutes to get the coffee and get ready?
Yes, 9:10 it is.
9:10. Thank you.
Thank you.